Real quickly, I just wanted to talk through some code optimization that we implemented in the setup of the SSO config class. You'll notice that we have a class called OIDC config, and then we also have a class called SAML config. And the reason why we have that is because the idea of SSO config has two different flavors, right? OIDC, open something, 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 and SAML standing for something, something, secure authentication markup language. Okay, so there are two different ways of describing a similar thing, and so it kind of makes sense to say, okay, well, I can have two different classes that have a base class, so a base class being SSO config, that it's, well, based off of, or a parent class. So we're talking about hierarchy. Sorry. We're talking about object-oriented programming with inheritance. So the base class for SAML and OIDC config must receive the auth class, and it has two properties, enforce, allow-list, and IDP certificate, which are two properties that must be on both classes, we assume. Now, the base class will also give all of my classes the set attribute function, or method rather, as well as .update and toJSON. Now let's take a look at from JSON. So if I look at OIDC config, I can see, okay, these are the mandatory properties of OIDC config. Here are some optional properties, and then we have from JSON. Now within from JSON, we say, okay, let's take the API response object. We're going to create a new object where everything is spelled with snake case. Okay, fine. Then we're going to pull the properties enforce allow list, override SSO, and IDP certificate. We're going to use .pop. Remember, .pop takes the property called enforce whitelist from the object and removes it from that dictionary and then stores it as a new value. So that's .pop. And then we create an instance of the class. So we create an instance of OIDC config, passing in auth, and then destructuring all of the remaining attributes of a new object. Okay, that's good. Let's take a quick look at what we did in SAML. So in SAML, you'll notice we see a lot of familiar code. It's pretty much the same. And I don't love that. I do not like writing the same code twice. And what's interesting to consider is the field is enabled, and the fields enforce allow list and IDP certificate are defined on the base class. I know all instances of SSO must have a certificate and must have the enforce allow list parameter. I know that's true because it's written into the base config as attributes. So you might make the argument, okay, we're writing the same code twice. How can we not repeat ourselves? Don't repeat yourself in your code. So we refactor this a little bit. If we go back to the parent, so if we go back to SSO config, we can see, all right, these three properties, because as it turns out is enabled, IDP enabled is a common property. We added that to the config class, and then we created a base or a parent from JSON function, where we're going to pass in some familiar friends, the object, the auth, the object. I'm passing in raw, which will be which I've added here as well. I've set it to repr equals false, so it doesn't print the raw API response, but we're going to keep it on the base class so that we can refer to it if we're ever wondering, hey, what did the API actually send back versus what is the, what I renamed the fields. Okay. Continuing to look up the parent from JSON function or class method, we'll say, hey, we moved that convert keys to snake case because we want all of our keys to be snake case. We know that IDP enabled is a field that must exist on the SSO config, so we pop that off of the new object. And we want to convert that value to a Boolean if it is a string, because sometimes Domo's APIs return the text TRUE instead of the Boolean value true. So we just have a method there for converting them. And then same thing for the enforce allow list. I renamed it from whitelist to allow list so that our library can use more inclusive names, but the API does in fact call it whitelist, which is fine, but that's why it's in here that we renamed that property. I added debugging capabilities to allow me to print what is left on new object after we've popped some of these attributes. Print is enabled just to make sure that it's turning into a Boolean. Enforce allow list, same thing. Now you'll notice we don't handle certificates. We don't handle destructuring the certificate in this parent to JSON function. But we do handle the process of converting or creating an instance of the SSO config class, passing in the properties that we've pulled off, as well as passing in the raw API response and quarks and new object. So new object, of course, being the object that we passed in. Now let's talk about quarks. Quarks stands for keyword arguments, and you can take any function and pass in quarks. And the way that looks like is here, if I write a function called foo that just receives keyword arguments, I can say, let's say print quarks. And so if I call it, I can say foo a equals 1, b equals 2, c equals 3. And so I can have a function where I pass an indeterminate number of keyword arguments, and they get stored in a dictionary called quarks. So it's a dictionary here. So a equals 1, b equals 2, c equals 3 gets captured as a dictionary. Now, if I know that I'm going to receive a certain value, so let's say I know I'm expecting to receive a string called auth, and then keywords, again, I can say, okay, I don't know what keywords I'm going to be receiving, so I'll say quarks, and that's a dictionary. So here, in my call, these are the indeterminate keywords, the ones that I can't predict. And yes, of course, we do have auth as well. Return auth and do stuff with it, right? Word sensitive specs. So what does that mean in the context of my parent from JSON? So here I'm saying, hey, I wrote this function. I know I'm expecting to receive an auth. I know I'm expecting to receive object and raw and debug print, but I don't know what else I'm receiving. So just store that in quarks. Then what I will say is, hey, print the quarks, but more importantly, destructure the dictionary into the class. And so basically I'm functionally saying quarks should be parameters that should be passed directly to the class. So I can say, if I were going to leave a comment, parameters that will be passed to the class of So theoretically, if I pass in the parameter and force allow list into parent from JSON, it would store that in the dictionary quarks and then destructure that value into the class. And so the way we can see that in action, come here, we said, all right, here's my class SSO OIDC config. I have my function called from JSON, which is the standard way we set up all of our classes. We pass an auth, we pass in the API response. The first thing I do is I create a copy of the API response using the deep copy function. And that's raw API response. We're not going to touch that, leave that alone. Next, I know that for the OIDC class, the field called override SSO, capital SSO, I want to store that in a property, or sorry, in a variable called override underscore SSO. And then take my IDP certificate. It's stored in the API response as the word certificate. So I'll say if my object has the attribute certificate, pop it, so remove it from the object and store it in IDP certificate, else none. And then what I can do is when I call parent from JSON, I can pass in these override SSO and IDP certificate into my parent from JSON class, which I am inheriting from the base SSO class. Cool. So which of these parameters are explicitly named in the definition of parent from JSON, and which of these are being passed into the keywords arguments, the quarks dictionary? Let's go take a look. So auth, object, raw, and debug PRN are defined in the parent function, but override SSO and IDP certificate are not. So if I come up to here, so again, auth, object, raw, and debug PRN are defined as variables that I expect to receive parameters for. They're in fact required variables, except for debug print. And then everything else goes to quarks. And so again, those values get passed into the class instantiation by destructuring quarks. What that allows me to do, right, the reason why we're doing this, it allows me to say, hey, this from JSON function for OIDC, it's got some stuff that's consistent with the base class, and it's got some stuff that's unique to how I set up, or how I receive an API response from OIDC. And these are the things that are special about OIDC. Okay, let's see that same concept repeated for SAML. So for SAML, again, I have a from JSON function. It has the same input arguments. I have the same deep copy, but the field called is enabled from the API is just called enabled. So that's something unique to the response from the SAML API. So I destructure, or sorry, pop that value into a new variable. And then I ultimately pass it into from JSON. And again, this value will get stored as quarks. Same thing for the IDP certificate. In OIDC, it was just called certificate. And in the SAML response, it's called IDP certificate. So this is unique to this API response, and so I need to have like two different functions. What is the from JSON function that is unique to my implementation of the SAML class method versus what can I just recycle from the parent, or what can I move to the parent that will be consistent across all of my APIs? Yeah, that's just it in a nutshell. It took a little bit of back and forth, right? Because I couldn't remember how this API was spelled correctly, and there might have been, like, sometimes it includes a certificate, sometimes it doesn't. And so, like, getting the syntax exactly right kind of takes a little back and forth. But what I like about this approach is I can say, hey, these fields are unique to setting up SAML. And these fields are unique to setting up OIDC. And if I discover down the line, ooh, some of this stuff has overlap and they're consistent across both SSO configuration definitions, then I can move them into the base class. Asking myself if I have any other examples of that that you might see. The top of my head, I can't think of any, but I hope that's helpful. Go for it.